do believe we are live and ready to go. Good morning, everyone. I see we do have a few people on here. Thank you for joining me so early in this morning. If you could please let me know if you can hear me all right, or if you can't hear me. That would be certainly appreciated. I don't want to go through this whole thing with nobody being able to hear what I'm saying. Let's see here. So what I'm trying to do is this is going to be very informal. I'm going to run through a lot of the questions that I got from my students. I'm going to run through a lot of the just kind of set the stage for what happened on this day 20 years ago, and hopefully have a good discussion of exactly what happened, how we got to this point, and what's happened since. Why are we in the place that we're at? How has the world changed since 9/11? And so I had this little slideshow that I was going to show of all these pictures before 9/11, everything that's happened before. Thank you. Good. I'm glad you can hear me. But that's not working. So I just added this little picture of the morning of 9/11 from New York. See if I can add a couple more photos here that I want to put on there. When it comes to about we'll say about 8:40, according to my notes here. Where's my little cheat sheet? Of course, I don't have my little. Yeah, about 8:41. I'm actually going to put up a couple videos of news coverage from the day. And so you'll be able to see exactly what was going on the news. I believe I have a CNN coverage, NBC, and I also have ABC, but I haven't pulled that one over yet. So let me pull some of these other, here we go. There's 44. Okay, I want me to be up there. And there we go. So there's another one there. All of these pictures I'm crediting to the Atlantic. They put up a very good before, during, and then after series of photos. And so let me find one more here. The view from on top of the World Trade Center. Transition that there. Okay. And I'm still learning this program, so this is going to be a work in progress here. But let's go back to 2001. 2001 was a very different time 20 years ago. You think of all the things we did not have 20 years ago, how different everything really was. There were no smartphones. The internet was not new, but it's still, there's a lot of people that did not have it in their homes, and it wasn't readily available to them. We had certainly airports were very much different. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no YouTube. There was it was really a fledgling technology, even though it had been around for a little while. Many people still didn't have it, and they certainly didn't have it on them all the time. Right now we walk around with smartphones, and we all have it everywhere we go. And so very much different time. And so I was thinking about everything that's happened since then, and all the changes that have happened in our country and the world. And really, you can take everything back to this one event. and before, of course, but you can really go back to 9/11 to see where everything changed. And the video that I'm working on right now that I had to stop so I could get everything prepared for this was looking at how we got to the point where Islamic jihadist terrorism grew throughout the 20th century to the point where we got to where Osama bin Laden and his group Al Qaeda felt the need to want to attack America with airplanes to draw them, the U.S., into a conflict and essentially to try to take the country down by destroying ourselves from within. That was the overarching goal, and it's an open question, and one for you to consider is, how successful was he at doing that? How successful were they at turning us against each other and trying to destroy the U.S. from within? If you see all the distrust, all of the anger, the frustration, the distrust in the government, the distrust in media, the distrust in ourselves, and you can draw a direct line from 9/11 to today. And so it's really important to reflect on exactly where we have come along this way. So right now, 20 years ago, it's early in the morning. People are starting to file into their jobs at the Pentagon, the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was the tallest buildings in New York. Beat out the previously tallest building, the Empire State Building, when they were finished. The construction was finished in the 1970s. And so it was kind of a landmark of New York. It was visible from all over. And what you could see in terms of one of the questions I got was, why were the World Trade Centers targeted? Why was it the focus to look at the World Trade Centers? The reason for it was because they wanted to hit America, all the different aspects of it at the same time. The World Trade Centers were the kind of beacon of American capitalism. And the Pentagon, U.S. military strength, and the Capitol, U.S. democracy. So those were the targets. The fourth plane, which we'll talk about, was aimed and headed toward the Capitol, they believe, if it hadn't been crashed in Pennsylvania. And so if you hit all those things at the same time, then you strike a major blow against the U.S., and we struggle to recover. So that was the idea. But we go back now 20 years, and at this point in time, at this exact time, American Airlines Flight 11 would be boarding in, make sure I get all this right, in Boston. So at Boston Logan International Airport, we've got Flight 11 that's boarding and probably Flight 175 that is also boarding as well. And so Flight 11 is going to take off here in about 4 minutes at 7:59. And then Flight 175 is going to take off at about 8:14. And then we have flight, let's see here. It's not too long after that we get the first indication that there's a hijacking that has been taking place. All right, so let me go through a couple questions I got was, where was I during this time? So I'm going to reveal a lot of things I've never really talked about before, but where was I? I was in high school. I was a freshman in high school. And I remember going into business class, actually. It was a general business class. This was about 10 o'clock in the morning. And we got the first indications that something had happened. We've kind of heard rumblings in the hallways, but this is, again, being a different time, high school. Now, I haven't been to high school in quite a while, But a lot of people have cell phones, smartphones. You would be getting messages if something like this was happening. We didn't have anything like that. Most people didn't have cell phones. I certainly didn't have one. I didn't get my first cell phone until I was 16 or 17 years old, and it was just this old junky phone that my dad found in his desk drawer that he gave me. And so it didn't work very well, but you didn't have that information readily available to you. You weren't getting dinged all the time with text messages and alerts and everything like that. And so if you try to put yourself back into that situation, you just kind of hear rumblings, maybe a little bit of people talking in the hallways, talking about something that might have happened, some building on fire. It didn't really register much to us that we just knew something was going on. And so you get to, I was sitting in there and they actually told us what happened, that there was planes that hit the Trade Center towers. And I remember them bringing in a TV and they put it on and we were watching it. And it was really hard to process and hard to fathom exactly what we were looking at, what we were watching. And so I don't know how much it registered at the time, but I do remember one of the buildings started to come down. And it was at that point they turned off the TV and said, okay, we're not going to watch this anymore at this point. And then they, within the next half hour or so, sent us all home. So we all went home and I was just walking back. And just trying to think about what exactly was going on. And it wasn't until later that day that I learned all of what had happened. Little did I know how much everything would change from that point in time. Everything kind of became oriented toward terrorism, and terrorism became the number one issue. It went from barely even being registered, barely even being discussed, to being elevated to probably the top issue on people's minds and in the public discourse and the focus of public policy for several years to come after that. And was I afraid was one question that I got. I don't think that I was afraid. I don't think it registered to me exactly what it would have meant at the time. But were a lot of people afraid? Did fear spread across America? Absolutely. Absolutely it did. And right now we're at 7:59. So this is when the first flight, Flight 11, American Airlines Flight 11, is taking off from Boston at this point in time. And it's leaving. What it's going to do, they're going to up and leave. They're going to, in about 15 minutes, start to take over the plane and then turn around back toward New York. And that's the very first plane that was notified of being hijacked, the very first one that took off. And so, let's see here. I want to address some of the other questions. One of the things that I might as well just get this part out of the way now. The common theme that I'm gonna keep hitting on is tragedy and trust. Tragedy and trust. What do these tragedies do to our trust in the systems we rely on? What does it do to our trust in each other and how we view the world? What does it do to our ability to identify what's real and what's not real, what's true? Because, and this is one of the things that questions I got about, is am I going to touch on the 9/11 conspiracy theories? And I don't think that getting into the details of those here at this point on this day this isn't the appropriate venue for that. But I think that it is important to address what the impact was of those conspiracies that came out of 9/11 and what it did to us and the way we think, the way we process and from what we hear and what we believe. Because, I mean, you've got the conspiracy theories kind of started right afterwards from all the different questions as to what actually happened. The problem what you get into in just a general looking conspiracy theories, and I know of the conspiracy theories. I've looked at many of them. I've looked at some of the presentation, the evidence, and I'll get more into conspiracy theories in other videos I'm going to post. I think it deserves its own special concentrated attention. The trouble you get into with these conspiracy theories is if you are going to there's a segment of the population who will completely dismiss all of them. None of them are true. There's nothing to it. You hear somebody talking about a conspiracy or something that doesn't make sense, and it's kind of immediately dismissed. There's another segment of the population who believes these conspiracies full stop. That is a true believer and will not be convinced otherwise. Most people are going to be somewhere in the middle. And even those who do believe, well, there might be something to that, are going to be in the, well, maybe not, we need to look into it kind of camp. If you completely dismiss a conspiracy theory to show a true believer, then that is going to be push them more toward that conspiracy. It's going to, if you dismiss questions about things that don't make sense, then you push somebody toward the belief. Look at what we're experiencing right now with arguments over masks and vaccines and not trusting the information you're hearing from the government and not trusting each other and putting each other's health at risk. And what you see is that if you just completely dismiss or just there's an immediate reaction to, if you don't believe any of the conspiracies, you look at somebody who does and say, you're an idiot, all that stuff is ridiculous, you're a conspiracy theorist, and you end up kind of pushing somebody toward, okay, well, the defensiveness position. Why aren't you listening to me? Whatnot. The same can be said for those who believe or are trying to explain something to if you're trying to explain something to somebody who believes a conspiracy and you're presenting alternative information, you're asking other questions about, well, does that really make sense? You're kind of flipping it on them and asking them, okay, what's the evidence here? Why are you looking at this? Why do you believe this? And you can end up kind of becoming part of the conspiracy by over questioning it. But each side kind of going back and forth, there's certain sides that won't believe something alternative to what they already do no matter what. But most people are going to be in the middle. But in terms of the conspiracies, and again, I don't want to put a huge focus on this at this point, but it can't be completely dismissed in terms of the impact that it has on the way people think. One survey I saw, I pulled this up this morning, in terms of people that believe in conspiracies, and this is from a few years ago, but about half of Americans, I was seeing between a third and a half, somewhere around there, believe some level of conspiracy about the 9/11 attacks. And so that was more than who believed in the JFK assassination or many of the other conspiracy theories out there. So the impact of so many people believing that there was some type of conspiracy here can't be dismissed. Even if it is all completely untrue, the fact that so many people believe it is important in and of itself. And that's something that we need to reckon with, because you can look at draw a line from the 9/11 conspiracies to what happened with the war in Iraq and the campaign to enter Iraq and the direct link between 9/11 and the decision to invade Iraq, and then later coming out that there were no weapons, there was no direct connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, and you start to see where this trust really breaks down and starts to spread. It didn't start there. It didn't start there. It started a long time ago. I would argue, and I'm going to talk about this in a future video, I would argue that the trust breakdown started a long time ago back when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. That was really the starting point, and immediately you kind of came out, well, there was this one person, and people were like, come on. One person did this, and then there was the Warren Commission, and now at least half of Americans don't believe that JFK was assassinated by just one person. And I'm not going to speak to the validity of any of the arguments or anything like that. That's a whole separate matter. But then you get to going further. You get to the Vietnam War, and you get to the unsettlement that caused and the social upheaval of the 60s, and you get to Watergate, and you start to find out more information about how the government has been keeping things from you and not telling you the full truth. And then you span that all along, and then you get to 9/11, and you know, are you really surprised so many people believe in all of these, that the official story isn't everything that actually happened. And so now, then you get to the Iraq War, and then you get, so now everything you get, people don't know who to trust anymore. And that was one of the things that 9/11 really put into overdrive, is this lack of trust, and how different tragedies and tragic situations really break down the trust. And now there's a certain segment of the population now who will not believe anything that comes out of the government. They don't believe official stories. Everything's a conspiracy. And the number of people who would, it's harder and harder to decipher, even for those, most of us who are well-meaning, just trying to figure out what's happening and what the actual truth is. It's hard to figure that out. And so that was something that wasn't as widespread. There was an anti-government movement. There was more on the right before 9/11, that you have different events like Ruby Ridge and Waco, and then the Oklahoma City bombing. And so there was this conspiratorial thinking and anti-government ideology. It was there before. It's been present for a long time. But 9/11 and the outgrowth of that was something that really put it into overdrive. And now, if you go back 20 years ago, we didn't have the type of oversight and surveillance that we have now. 20 years ago, there weren't cameras everywhere. There wasn't a smartphone in everybody's pocket where you could instantly track them. There wasn't the ability to hack into anybody's phone or computer at pretty much any given time. And so there's this feeling now that you're always being watched, you're always being looked at, you're always being possibly treated with suspicion, you're always being spied on. And so that certainly adds to this feelings of distrust. And so I started thinking about, where do we go from here? How do we figure out what's actually true and what's not true? And that's one of the reasons why I focused quite a bit in another video that I posted on the importance of looking at information literacy, critical thinking, and scientific inquiry. And it's one of the things that I point to at the beginning of every time I teach a course. Lately I've looked and pointed to that to say, here, watch this. And so if you haven't watched that, I encourage you to do so, to just point out how difficult it is to decipher information now. Once upon a time, there was a different problem because there was only a few limited sources of information. Think about, let's take news sources, for instance. You had your major newspapers, you had your local newspapers, and in terms of television, you had 3 broadcast channels, and you didn't really have cable. So everybody got the same information from the same sources. It's kind of washed out there a little bit, isn't it? The light's starting to come up, and so now the light's all kind of getting messed with here a little bit. So it kind of simulates the morning from 20 years ago. But what we, let's see, I'll get off track here. So yeah, everybody gets information from kind of the same sources. Now you have online news, you have new media, you have how many different cable stations, how many different news channels and stations, all presenting different information, and some of them that are deliberately feeding misinformation, some more than others. Some have clear biases, pointing you in one direction or the other. Some are being tailor-made to, like you have, for instance, Fox is tailor-made for Republicans. You have MSNBC is tailor-made for Democrats. You have some stations that are just pumping out just blatant garbage. And the amount of information that's available online to try to cipher through, it's an enormous challenge. And trying to figure out, okay, what is good quality sources of information? What is actually going to give me something that I can actually use to learn and get at what the truth is? And getting at what the truth is enormously difficult now, more so than before. We have more information now than we ever had before, but trying to decipher through it all is enormously challenging. And so that makes getting everybody kind of on the same page as to what the actual truth is enormously difficult. And you see that now with what's going on with the pandemic that we're continuing to be embroiled in, and how everybody's kind of at each other's throats, turning on each other and fighting with each other. And again, this is certainly not everybody, but there's a lot of anger and frustration out there, and a belief that we are not being told everything, or there's we're being taken advantage of, or being led down a bad path, or however you want to phrase it. So that is kind of where we're at now, and so it's an enormous challenge to figure out where we go from here. But now we're at 8:14 in the morning, and so I wanted to do a little text that would show, okay, what exactly is happening now, but I couldn't quite get all that to figure out. I also wanted to have a time up here, but I couldn't get that thing to figure out either. So maybe I can add it to the video later that's posted on YouTube. But at 8:14, United Airlines Flight 175 is now taking off from Boston. Again, same as the Flight 11, also headed toward LA. And so in a couple minutes, we're going to get the indication of the first hijacking, which is would be taking place right now on Flight 11. So it happened very quickly after the flight took off. And so that they're going to get ground control is going to be getting indications of exactly what's happening. They're going to be turning the flights back around to head toward D.C. And the first 2 that are hijacked are the first 2 that would hit the towers. And so at about a half hour from now is when the first tower would be hit. That's the North Tower. So let me go to a couple questions here. So I pulled some of the questions. I got some great questions from students, current and previous. A couple of my past students from previous classes sent me some questions. So again, yeah, about the, let's see here. How different was the airport? How were these individuals able to get on these planes so easily? One of the biggest things that has changed is airport security. And the airport, it was a completely different place 20 years ago. You could actually go up to the gate and meet people. There wasn't a massive list of things that you couldn't take on the planes. There wasn't, you didn't have to take your shoes off. You didn't have to pull everything out. There certainly was security, of course, but it wasn't anything like it was today. And it's a direct result of 9/11 and why going through the airport is like getting an aneurysm these days, and why I hate flying so much. And so I prefer not to do it. But the TSA was non-existent. There was no such thing. This was created in the years after 9/11. And so if you can imagine just going to an airport without these massive lines, without all of the security measures that were put in place, and so completely and entirely different. If there were these policies in place, would the attacks could have been prevented? It's hard to say. There's certainly some things that would have been identified, probably, like the box cutters that they used, that wouldn't have been allowed on the planes. But there's other things that they could have taken on the planes as well. Is it possible? That's challenging to say, because it's hard to say. It's kind of hard to do a counterfactual of what could have happened if this was in place. But certainly that's the idea to try to prevent people from getting onto airplanes. So much attention has been placed on airport security and with the no-fly lists and the prevention of taking certain things on the planes and enhanced screenings and so forth, that it's certainly possible that people could have been stopped from getting on the planes. But it's also possible not. I mean, there's been reviews of TSA's screening procedures that have found massive holes in it still to this day, and the amount of things that actually get through. So that is certainly, it's really tough to say, but it's certainly possible. And so now we're at 8:20, and it's at this point that Flight 77 is going to be taking off. Flight 77. That one was the one that was headed toward the Pentagon. So it's actually taking off from D.C., and so it will actually be in the air quite a while before it's turned around. So that's 7:20. Again, the airplanes, there were 92 people on board Flight 11, 65 people on board Flight 175, and on 77 there were 64 people on board that flight. And so Flight 93 is the fourth one, and that one is not going to take off for another 20 minutes or so. So that one takes off at about 8:41. Okay. Other security changes since 9/11 were is it true that if there are undercover agents on all planes sitting amongst civilians? No, there. Now it could be wrong, certainly, but to my understanding, that you're talking about air marshals with that question. There was an increase in air marshals after 9/11, but you, there are not on every single flight somebody there. That program hasn't received as much funding, and you got to think of the logistics too. The number of flights that take off every single day in the U.S. to have somebody on each and every single one of those planes, the logistics of that would just be mind-boggling. But there's certainly, while there are there's less air marshals than there were before, there certainly are many on planes still to this day, to my recollection. And now it's about this time that the first of two different accidental transmissions are going to be made from Flight 911. So one of the hijackers, Mohammed Atta, made an accidental transmission to air traffic control while he was trying to talk to the cabin, while he was trying to talk to them. But basically he said something along the lines of, we have some planes, don't worry, we're heading back to the airport. And so that was kind of the first indication that they got that something else was going on up in the air. And other things that were happening this morning, 20 years ago. So at this time, there was actually a military exercise that was underway. That was a training war games exercise. That was one of the reasons why it was so chaotic in terms of getting a response out and why it took so much time. And so there's actually they were trying to figure out, okay, is this real world? Is this part of the exercise that we're undergoing? And so it wouldn't be for a little while until any planes were actually assembled to get in the air to try to see what was going on, or to try to intercept any planes or anything like that. So there was a lot of confusion at the time. The President George W. Bush, he was down in, gosh, I'm going to get this wrong. Yeah, he was down in Florida, that's right. He was down in Florida at an elementary school doing a reading with school children, and was preparing to talk about education, his educational programs, and his education agenda. And so that's where they were at. And so soon I'll be able to start the footage. So, what was I going to say? What else was happening that day? Let's see here. Yep, so the president was down in Florida, and so everybody was kind of at this time filing into their jobs at the trade center. And so there's actually, if there's any silver lining about the timing of this, and the timing of when the planes hit and what happened in terms of commuter traffic, is that people were still filing in. This complex was like a small city, up to, like, I think it was maybe 20 to 30,000 people worked in these buildings at the World Trade Center complex in any given day. If these planes had hit at any point in time later in the day, if they had hit at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, noon, the casualties would have been exponentially higher. And so, given the time that they actually hit, a lot of lives were not lost that potentially could have been. And so that is something that just hard to think about. I mean, we think about the number of casualties, the 2,997 people who did die in these attacks. The casualties could have been far greater. And so that is the World Trade Center complex. So if we look at, this is one of the things that's going to be, let's see, the World Trade Center. I wanted to pull this picture up. But the way it looked was you had multiple different buildings all sitting together kind of in the same area. You had the two towers, but then you also had 5 other buildings. You had other buildings that were sitting around the area. And so each one of those buildings was impacted in different ways by the burning of the towers, the collapse of the towers, the debris that fell off, the dust and cloud smoke. And again, one of those buildings, you get to, I was talking about the views, the conspiracy theories, and so forth a little bit earlier. One of those buildings was Tower 7 that also collapsed but was not hit by anything. And so that kind of feeds into the, okay, why did that building collapse and so forth? So what was happening there? And that made it certainly fueled a lot of these conspiratorial views. Let's see here. Let me pull up a little map so we can actually see here. Oops. Man, I wish that slideshow worked, because then it could actually have something moving on here. Let's see here. All right, there we go. So you can see the towers here, the 2 World Trade Center towers, and then you had, so it's buildings 1 and 2, and then you had building, you had the other buildings here around the complex. All these buildings were damaged by the collapse. And then you had World Trade Center 7, which is right above. And so you can see all the different buildings in the area that were impacted there. So again, if you're just joining here, welcome. Thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. I've never tried or done anything like this before. I'm hoping to have some more streams kind of like this, where I address different topics or issues and things that come up. But so this is a whole new kind of endeavor, and so just want to, hopefully this all goes well. Again, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to start footage that would have been going on at the time, television footage from NBC, CNN, that was looked at exactly what was happening at that time. So you'll be able to see, while I'm kind of talking about some of these different issues here, what was happening, how that was being covered, and I'll keep the volume down because I don't want to accidentally get flagged or anything like that, but I do want to show what was going on at the time and how everybody was kind of coming in and seeing it, because you would have had so many different people tuning on to the television to watch and see exactly of what was happening. And it was a majorly traumatic event for everybody who was looking at it and watching it. And it was one of those rare events that kind of brings everybody together immediately. And in the immediate aftermath, and this is one of the things we can kind of get into, but in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was a kind of a coalescing together around support for the U.S. Not only patriotism here in the U.S., but around the world as well. And there was an overwhelming outreach of support for the U.S. and for the victims and for condemnation of these attacks. And there was also an overwhelming kind of sense of, okay, we need to go after the people who did this. We need to go after those who attacked us. And so that was where the decision, not long after that, was to go to Afghanistan. And because when Afghanistan is where the Al-Qaeda training camps were, that was where bin Laden was hiding. That was where the planning for the attacks took place. And this is where you had the Taliban, who was in control since 1996 of Afghanistan, and they had kind of given a safe haven to Al-Qaeda. There was kind of a mutual agreement. They shared a lot of the similar ideologies, but they weren't one and the same. So it's important to distinguish between the two. That while they were certainly sympathetic to bin Laden and his group, they weren't fully on board or anything with everything that he believed or everything he was doing. The Taliban is more focused on, it's more of a local local militant force. They're interested in the Afghanistan and control of Afghanistan, and they're not really that interested in global ambitions. Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, completely different, interested in more of a global look. And so it's important to distinguish between groups that are kind of locally focused and groups that are focused on more of a broad global control, or they want to wage global jihad, as it's termed, but they want to effectively, the goal of Al-Qaeda was effectively to implement a strict view of interpretation of Islam again around the entire world and subject all Muslims to that. This is something you saw very clearly when ISIL was established in 2014, and al-Baghdadi came out and said, I am not a leader. We have a world caliphate. All Muslims around the world will bow to and will respond and pay tribute to me and my group. Very different from a local militant force like the Taliban was. But the decision to go into Afghanistan was based on the desire to, okay, let's get rid of bin Laden. Let's get rid of Al-Qaeda. Let's drive them back. Let's make sure that they're never able to attack from that base in Afghanistan to the U.S. Again, that they won't pose a threat. And so it was very quickly after 9/11, within the next, by early next year, that was basically they were driven out. Not only out Al-Qaeda, but also the Taliban, completely driven out of Afghanistan. And at that point, you get to, okay, what's next? What do we do now? Where do we go forward? And it's at that point where the broad consensus, the let's go and get them, the the mentality of uh, seeking justice for these attacks begins to break down a little bit, because when you have a clear focus on one person or one group based on one attack, that's one thing. But then after that, it starts to go, okay, now what are we doing? What's our goal? What's our mission? What are we trying to accomplish here now? And so that is where the broad consensus begins to crack and begins the support for the U.S. both internally and internationally begins to start to wane a little bit, especially then when you get into where the focus shifts to. Because the focus shifts from almost immediately from not just going after one specific terrorist organization, but it becomes a broad war on terrorism in general. A broad war on this idea of we're going to go after pretty much every terrorist group around the world that might pose a threat. And that really broadens the scope of what the focus is. And so that's where the broad sense of we're all in this together, we all need to band together, begins to break down a little bit. But not entirely yet. It wasn't until you get to Iraq and the decisions leading up to Iraq and the decision to shift focus from bin Laden and Afghanistan over to Iraq that you really start to have this division in any kind of consensus. And that's where everything kind of starts to take a different turn. But right now, it was very difficult to actually be against, to kind of pump the brakes on anything. It was very easy to move forward in a very fast pace to, okay, we need to go after the people who did this, but we also need more authority. We need more permissive ability to actually make sure this doesn't happen again. And so the question was, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And it wasn't too long. It was just a little over a month after 9/11 that you had the Patriot Act that was passed. And every single person in Congress, both parties, voted for the Patriot Act, save for one. And so that was really, whether or not you agree with the provisions of the Patriot Act, whether you don't, it's really rare to have something that transformative, that impactful of a piece of legislation, and all the provisions that came along with it, for that to pass so quickly and without any kind of major real debate was just a sign of when you put yourself back into that position and that shows how difficult it would have been to try to kind of pump the brakes on that, and where the sentiment amongst the politicians and the public was pointing all in the same direction. And so it was high charge and go, and to try to stop something like that would have been difficult to do. But when you look at the Patriot Act and how quickly it was passed, how little debate, I mean, I go through this in another one of my videos, but I mean, it was passed by one chamber one day, another chamber the next day, and then the next day it was signed. It was introduced, passed Senate, passed House, and then it was signed by the president the next day. And I may have switched the Senate House back and forth, but it happened very, very fast. And many of those provisions, the things that came out of there, the increased surveillance, the ability to, I would just pull it up here so I can go. But the no-knock warrants, the money laundering and material support provisions, the NSA spying programs. All these things were an outgrowth of that. And so now we're at 8:41 to get back. And now this is the point, 8:41, that the air traffic controllers and NORAD is being informed of what's happening. They're still kind of uncertain of exactly what was going on, but they're kind of being informed, okay, by air traffic controllers, yes, we have indications there was a hijacking. And they haven't scrambled the planes as of yet. And so now it's 8:41. Let me get this footage up here.
To consolidate your credit card or other debts, just log on.
Yeah. This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that
so this has not happened yet. So let me take that off and stop that. But you'll kind of see a little bit of what was actually happening. You can see this is the NBC news feed. And so this is the early show. Yep, 7:42. So I tried to sync these up as closely as I could. But you can kind of see what was happening on the television that morning. And you can now put the CNN one. That one starts right at 8:49, so just a couple minutes after the first plane hits. And so, as 8:41, 2 minutes ago, you had the first plane 93 took off with 44 people on board. That flight was taking off from Newark International Airport, headed to San Francisco. And it'll be just in a couple minutes here. Right now, the very first plane, is being flown into New York, and in just 2 minutes, at 8:46, would be the point where the first plane strikes. Let me bring...
Oh boy, are you grumpy?
I'm just curious. No, I'm just curious. All right, this is the one you and I are going to fight about, the 50s.
Okay.
The 50s, the decade when people had no imagination. You're going to tell me they were making this soup?
They were making this soup. Boy, and we published this recipe a lot.
Really?
Because of the electric blender. The electric blender
People used it to make Tang, that's all.
No, Pete, no, the Tang wasn't even around until the 70s. The electric blender was originally a bartender's tool. Fred Waring, the band leader, fell in love with it for making his daiquiris. He popularized this, and it came into the kitchen, and it cut a lot of time out of
the 50s, the dark ages for food.
Well, frozen foods, I guess, came in, but no, we had good recipes then.
All right, the 60s.
All right, now the 60s must have been 10 years too long for you, because cheese fondue was the most popular dish.
Not in my neighborhood.
Not
Until
in your
about this
neighborhood.
time.
Okay, well, it sure was
when
in mine.
you get...
All right, what are we drinking with this?
Sangria. Remember
And
all
there's
the
only a
sangria
little bit of
parties?
footage of
Or
the
maybe you
first
don't.
plane,
They were,
so-
and
That's fine.
we published
And I wish I
dozens
would've
of
gotten that to
recipes
put
for
on.
sangria. This one is delicious.
That's better
Really,
than mojito.
really good.
Let's move on to
Okay.
the 70s.
The
But it's
70s.
at this
Yet
point
another
where
thing
the
with
first
cheese.
plane's going to be
Sorry,
flying.
it
Jerry
wasn't my
Starosa, Kim
choice.
Williamson, thanks a lot. A lot of great planning there. Go ahead.
Fettuccine Alfredo. When we first published this recipe,
Thank you. Got an indication here that the volume is too loud on the news feed. Let's turn that down a little bit. So now we are in 8:46, and this is the point where the first plane is going to strike the North Tower. And it only takes a couple minutes before pretty much every news station, every TV station is going to switch over to continuous coverage of the attacks and the aftermath of them. And it's going to stay on there for quite a while. Pretty much the news is going to be dominated by this for the next few days, with pretty much everything is going to be covering this. And really, weeks and months, it's going to be the top story. Everything else kind of gets pushed underneath and is nowhere near the same amount of attention. So let's see here. We just got 2 minutes here. So it's at this point in time, within just immediately, that you have a mobilization of officers in New York, police officers, firefighters that are being dispatched to the World Trade Center. I mean, almost immediately. And so they're heading over to the North Tower, and what they're going to be doing is trying to go up and assess the damage and try to get as many people out of the tower as possible. And so as even the people that were in the North Tower, I mean, you could feel that they said later, you could just feel the building just shake and rumble. And, you know, they obviously heard something, but there was kind of, you know, chaos in the building. But it was a weird thing, but it was kind of, you know, what's actually happening here, they didn't really know. And even in the South Tower, I mean, you could kind of feel the vibration, because then you could see the obviously the smoke and the fire burning and everything when the plane hit and left a massive gash in the side and continued to burn pretty much throughout the next hour and a half or so. So let me get, again, I want to get all of this, try to get all this synced up as good as I could, but this is about the point in time where 8:40, 8:49. So I'll be pretty close. But
crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. CNN Center right now is just beginning to work on this story, obviously calling our sources and trying to figure out exactly what happened, but clearly something relatively devastating happening this morning there on the south end of the island of Manhattan. That is, once again, a picture of one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
I'm going to turn up the volume for the CNN coverage here and show you a little bit of that. And
it's crashed into one of the towers.
That'll give me a good chance to actually take a quick break and actually go refill water and all that. So I'll be back in a moment while I play this CNN coverage live here.
Murtaugh, I just was standing on the Vice President of Finance.
Sean,
Vice President of Finance for CNN.
Sean, we're on the air right now. What can you tell us about this situation?
Hello?
Yes, Sean, you're on the air right now. Go ahead. What can you tell us?
I just witnessed a plane that appeared to be cruising slightly lower than normal altitude over New York City, and it appears to have crashed into, I don't know which tower it is, but it hit directly in the middle of one of the World Trade Center towers.
Sean, what kind of plane? Was it a small plane, a jet?
It was a jet. Looked like a two-engine jet, maybe a 737.
You're talking about a large passenger commercial jet.
A large passenger commercial jet.
And where were you when you saw this?
I am on the 21st floor of 5 Penn Plaza.
Did it appear that the plane was having any difficulty flying?
Yes, it did. It was teetering back and forth, wingtip to wingtip, and it looks like it has crashed into probably 20 stories from the top of the World Trade Center, maybe the 80th to 85th floor. There's smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center.
Sean, what happened next? Does it appear to you that the plane is still inside the World Trade Center?
From my angle, I'm viewing south towards the Statue of Liberty and towards the World Trade Center. It looks like it is embedded in the building. I can't see from my vantage point whether it has come out the other side.
Sean, what about on the ground? Or any debris that is hit down there? Can you see
my vantage point is too far from the World Trade Center to make any determination of that.
Did you see any smoke, any flames coming out of the engines of that plane?
No, I did not. The plane just was coming in low, and the wingtips tilted back and forth, and then it flattened out. It looks like it's hit at a slight angle into the World Trade Center. I can see flames now coming out the side of the building, and smoke continues to billow.
Well, generally, is that a traffic area in New York for aircraft?
It is not a normal flight pattern. I'm a frequent traveler between Atlanta and New York for business, and it is not a normal flight pattern to come directly over Manhattan. Usually they come up either over the Hudson River heading north and pass alongside the island of Manhattan, or if they're taking off from LaGuardia, they usually take off over Shea Stadium and gain altitude around the island of Manhattan. It's rare that you have a jet crossing directly over the island of Manhattan.
Just for our viewers who are just tuning in right now, you're looking at a live picture of the World Trade Center Tower where, according to eyewitness Sean Murtaugh, he is a vice president of finance, an eyewitness to what he describes as a twin-engine plane or possibly a 737 passenger jet flying into the World Trade Center. It appears to be still embedded inside the building. Sean, are you in a position right now to hear whether any sirens are going, any ambulances, any sort of response to this yet?
Not from my vantage point. I'm probably 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the World Trade Center.
It is a remarkable scene, as we're seeing right now. Flames still coming out of the windows, black smoke billowing from what appears to be all sides. Obviously, windows shattered and steel jutting out from the structure right now.
And Sean, once again, we're looking at these pictures, and
you're
telling us...
I see them in my office. I have them on all my TVs.
And you're telling...
Okay. Turn that back down a little bit. All right, so that was kind of the coverage you can see from CNN that was playing. Turn that off there. At the same time, so you have... they're just trying to figure out exactly what was going on. And, okay. Let's see. There we go. There. That'll make those a little bit bigger. So I'm not going to have the volume up too loud on that. I'm hoping that you can hear me over that, and every now and then we kind of bring this back up. But it's at this point in time that we begin evacuating the towers. They're trying to figure out exactly what had happened. There's no real indication of anything that might be wrong at this point. Most of the discussion is, how could something have hit this tower when it's so clear outside, when it's so such a nice day? There's no indication of terrorism at all at this point. They're just trying to, because there's been many incidents of, many is overstating it, but there's been a lot of incidents of planes hitting into buildings. It was one of the things that this, there's planes hitting, I believe there was a plane that hit the World Trade Center before, a small little plane, not any kind of commercial jet or anything like that. There's a plane that's hit the Empire State Building. And so, okay, so what size is this plane? What could have possibly made it happen? Where there's miscommunication in air traffic control. So there's all indication now, at least from the way it's being framed, the way it's being discussed, is this something that could have been an accident? Is this something that could have been, what could have caused this as an accident to happen? That discussion of it being any kind of attack or anything like that is not being discussed very much, at least in terms of the news coverage and broadcast of it. Certainly being discussed amongst the military and being amongst officials and amongst this kind of chatter of the general public in terms of what's going on. But in terms of, there's no real speculation of that at this point. And so right now it's 8:56. So I'm a little, all right, so I'm a little bit off there. So let me kind of back it up a little bit. Just slightly. 50. Oops, that's the wrong one. This is trying to get used to this new program here. So I'm trying to sync these up as best as I can, so you can kind of see what it looked like. And that footage doesn't look very good right there. Hopefully that clears itself up. When I looked at it before, it didn't seem to be like that. But all right, so 8:57. As I mentioned before, firefighters and police officers are kind of coalescing around the building. Firefighters going up into the building. At this point, those that are in the South Tower have been starting to evacuate. And one of the tragic things about that is so many people are kind of pouring out, they're telling them instead to go back up. They're telling them to go back up to their offices because the South Tower at this point is secure. That's the thought process. So that's like, okay, we don't know what's going on, but there's a problem in the North Tower. And many people don't even know at this point that there was a plane. They just can see and have been heard that there's some kind of fire in the North Tower. And many people, there's just, it's not, all that information isn't being hit yet. It's not actually catching on or being spread out yet. And so they're trying to get everybody back up to their offices. And so a lot of the people that were coming down were going right back up. And some people were in, that could have escaped, ended up being back in their offices when the second plane will hit in just a few minutes. And so it's about this time, actually a couple minutes ago, while I was taking my little break there, that the president would have been informed at 8:50 about the plane that hit the tower. So I apologize. That's CBS coverage. That's not NBC. Let's see if we got. Let me see if I can pull up the other one here because I have an ABC coverage here as well. Oh, let's go stick with these. It was supposed to... And figuring out new program here for the first time. Thankfully, I was able to get these on here. That's why I was going to show a slideshow of these photos earlier, but then it wasn't bringing it up. So we'll just have to see here. Again, for those of you who are watching, thank you for being here this morning. The first time I've tried to do anything like this along these lines, some kind of live stream. But I thought it was important to kind of come back to this day and come back and look at how all this went down, how it all happened, and just kind of reflect on everything that's happened since. And so the one way to do that is to look at, kind of look at it in real time and put yourself back into that day and what everybody was seeing. As I was reflecting on this, I came to realize if you are, we have people now today that are of the age where they can legally drink that have no memory of this whatsoever. Have no, I mean, it's a historical event. It's something that you read about and you know the facts of, but you don't know what it was like in that particular moment, and to actually look through and experience it. And so the only real way to do it is to kind of, I guess, just kind of look and see what it was like. And so it's just about now, and I hope I have these synced up right, but it's going to be just about this point where the second plane is going to be coming in. The second plane is going to be hitting the second tower, and there it is, right there. You saw it kind of coming in, and there's the explosion. There's the fireball explosion. So let me get the NBC one kind of synced up here. So I'm actually on a little bit of a delay from what I can see is actually being shown here. But for you, because of that delay, from what I'm seeing to what you're seeing, it might actually be synced up pretty well and pretty close to the exact timing. So it's at this point, all the speculation about what this could have been, what could have happened, the accident, that all kind of goes out the window at this point. Because when you've got a second plane hitting the other tower, there's no way at that point that it could be anything other than a deliberate act. It would be you'd have to do some real mental gymnastics to come to the conclusion that two separate planes could have crashed into two different towers within 15 minutes of each other by accident at that point. And so what you can see here on the video is on the North Tower, it hit further up on the tower. So the very first one hit higher. So you can see the one on the right hit higher up on the building. The one on the left hit a little bit lower on the building. And that is going to be significant for how the events are going to unfold over the next hour and a half or so. That is going to be a substantial factor in terms of how these buildings come down. And we'll come back to that. All right, so 8:43. It's at this point, all the two remaining flights are still in the air, and so we have flight. Where is it? Flight 77 is still in the air. That took off from D.C. Flight 93 is still in the air, and it's at this point that an unprecedented decision is made by the FAA to ground all flights that are going out of New York City or anywhere around that airspace. And so the decision is first made to ground all the flights in New York City, and the decision is going to be made in about a half hour, a little bit less. Let me make sure the timing right. That they're going to ground all air travel throughout the U.S. entirely. Every single plane, non-military plane, is completely grounded for the first time ever. All flights that are currently in the air were being redirected to land, and so that in and of itself was just a major endeavor, trying to get some 3,000 planes that were up in the air at that time to just kind of all come down and land safely. And so that way they can completely clear the airspace, and they will be able to track everything that's remaining and find out just how extensive this is, because you don't know what is coming next. And here's where the fear of what is happening really starts to take hold, because when you've got two planes hitting these two buildings, and now we're trying to think, okay, what is next? What is coming? What else could be happening? And so the way you kind of can figure out if there are any other planes or any other attacks that are planned or anticipated, you have to ground all those planes. And so that would be the way. And then if there's any left that are unaccounted for, then you know these are ones you have to look out for, and you have to take into account. And so it's and at the same time, there's the crews, the firefighters are starting to make their way up into the towers, and they're hearing about now the second plane that's hit, and the sense of urgency now to, okay, we have to try to get as many people out of here as we possibly can. But there's already been hundreds of casualties, not just from the planes as they hit, but from all the people that were hit in the area where the planes hit. So there's hundreds of casualties there, but then this is constantly burning, and there's the smoke and the fire, and so people are being burned alive, and they're being suffocating in the smoke clouds, and it's just a horrific a scene, and just it's difficult to fathom how terrifying that would have been to be in the tower at that point in time. And to be for many people, there was no way to get out. I mean, many hundreds of people were able to get out and go down through the stairs. The elevators in some places were still working, but in others, the elevators were completely unusable. And for those who were above the where the planes hit, they're essentially trapped with no way to get down. And so that is enormously would be I can only imagine how that would have felt to be in that situation. One question that comes up is why they didn't attempt to do any kind of rescue, like to try to get to go on the side of the buildings or to land on top of the buildings. And if you're looking at this footage, you can see all that smoke and all the turbulence that would have created from the smoke billowing off the buildings. Landing would have put all of the rescue crews in serious danger, and it could have made the situation worse, as from what I've been told. And it makes sense when you're just kind of looking at the smoke and everything. To try to land, could have been the helicopter caught in turbulence, could have crashed on the top of the Trade Center, fallen down to the ground. It could have killed more people. So that was the reason why that particular attempt wasn't made. And so it's really it's tragic too, because you have the police that are circling around in helicopters, just trying to get a view to see exactly what is happening and to get a better sense of it. And the helplessness they must have felt too. Of you see the buildings, the people are inside there, and you want to help, and there's nothing to be done. There's nothing that you can do at that moment. So the helplessness there, as we're kind of all looking at it. So you can see here more views. This is kind of playing on loop now, the continuously playing and trying to just kind of get an assessment of just looking at this. Everything continuing to burn. And so thankfully many people were able to get out, but again, so many people trapped up there. And so one of the things I wanted to do was just to give you a sense of what it was like there. I was asked about, one of the questions I got was about different documentaries or other footage or things like that. I'll share some of those, post some of those. There's been a lot of dramatic recreations, and there's been a lot of, but I think, so you can kind of get a sense of what it was like through those, but just listening to the testimonies too of the people who were there and who were able to get out, and listening to the phone calls, because it's many are using their non-smartphones, their old flip phones, or the giant blocks that we used to have. You're getting a lot of phone calls from the towers, just trying to get out to loved ones, family members, to get a sense of what else everybody's seeing, and just to, let them, you're letting your family know, okay, I'm here, I'm okay, and so you can get a sense of what it was like in that situation when you hear some of these calls, and you hear some of these discussions, and you hear the testimony, the interviews, and the words of the people who were there. You can cover it much better than I can. So I can provide some of those sources. All right, so now we're at about 9:15 in the morning, and it's at this point where they're starting to realize, okay, there's another flight here. There's another flight here that's been hijacked, and that's Flight 77. And so it's becoming apparent that they're trying to figure out exactly where that flight is headed to. And so there's it's tracked for a while. The flight was coming out of D.C., and they got it turning around, heading back toward D.C., and it's shortly after that the signal was cut. So they weren't able to track it after that. But they did have indications that yes, it was hijacked, and it was turned around, and it was diverted from its original path to Los Angeles. And also in the air, of course, is Flight 93, and that was, let me make sure I got that. That was coming from New York to San Francisco. And of course, Flight 77 was the one that crashed into the Pentagon, and Flight 93 was slated to be headed toward the U.S. Capitol. And so, as I said earlier, the idea here of what Al-Qaeda wanted to do, what bin Laden's plan was to strike at the heart of America, and to really strike at the heart of everything that symbolized America. So the Twin Towers were a symbol of U.S. Financial and capital strength, U.S. financial strength. that was why those two towers were targeted. The Pentagon, obviously, U.S. military. So U.S. military strength, and then the capital, U.S. democracy. So you've got U.S. Capitalism and financial, military, and democracy, all to be hit at the same time in the same day. And so you see some of the footage now that's showing, you can see the one on CNN there. They're trying to, a lot of the questions are, what type of plane is this? Because the news is starting to get indications of, okay, this is, there were reports of hijackings. They are confirming those things. And, okay, what kind of plane was it? Was it a small plane? Was it a commercial jet? What exactly was it that hit? And at the same time, you're getting a lot of you're getting a lot of conflicting information. And when something like this happens, and a major incident like this happens, information is coming so fast and so quickly that you're just trying to decipher through it all and figure out what's true. So you get a lot of unsubstantiated reports that come in. You get a lot of information that ends up being wrong, but it's crucial in this point in time, in the immediate aftermath and the immediate shortly after, the information that comes out kind of, it helps set the narrative for everything that's to come later. And so it's so crucial that, and I have a whole video on this in terms of the media representation of terrorism and terrorism incidents and how they portray different things. But it's so important to kind of be responsible in reporting in real time, because and to not jump to too many conclusions and speculative conclusions. So you'll get, because oftentimes when you're in the heat of the moment, you can get things wrong or be pointed in the wrong direction. One example of this, even for people who are kind of look at this a lot, either government experts or researchers or people who've seen less things like this before. I'll give you a perfect example of one thing that I got wrong at one time: the Boston Marathon bombing, and I talk about this in another video. When that happened in 2013, my first thought when I was watching it live in real time was this was a far-right attack, because it happened right in the middle of April. It was Patriots Day. It was tax day. It was just a couple days away. All in that same time, you had Waco that happened within that same span of that same week. You had the Oklahoma City bombing that also had happened at that time. So that was my first thought, is this is what this was. It certainly would fit. But come to find out then later, no, this was a jihadist attack. And this was a jihadist bomb by two brothers who set it off there at the Boston Marathon. So even your first indications of what this could be aren't necessarily the case. One of the reasons why there was a lot of speculation and a lot of people kind of came to the conclusion that this was an act of jihadist terrorism was the events that preceded and the attacks that preceded this. And one of the things that often gets forgotten in the aftermath of this obviously more dramatic and impactful attack is that this is not the first time that the World Trade Center was targeted. Back in 1993, there was a truck bomb that went off in the basement car garage area of the World Trade Center. I remember which tower. I have it written down. It's in another one of my videos, but it was blew a giant hole in the side of the building, and the goal of that was to blow up the building at the bottom, collapse one tower, into the other one and knock both of them down at the same time. And so, obviously, in the aftermath of that bombing from '93, and now the same target being hit, there's a lot of people are even in the media or just everyday people. Some people are starting to kind of put that together. This is probably what this is. But there were a lot of investigators that kind of knew right away that, okay, this is Al-Qaeda. This is they're coming back and targeting the Trade Center to finish the job that they started on 1993. And in the one of the questions I got was, were there indications of what was coming? Were there indications that this was going to happen? Was there anything to lead up to point to this? And yes, there was. Make sure I'm not missing any crucial things. Okay. There were a lot of investigations into the hijackers, rather, in the months leading up to the crash or the attacks. They had been being tracked. They were by different agencies. There was a lot of intelligence on bin Laden and his group, and the fact that he was placing people in different positions around the world, and he had infiltrated and had agents in the U.S. And so there was intelligence out there, and there were some officials in the government, CIA, FBI, that were really trying to focus in on, okay, we need to pay more attention to this. This is a real threat. And it started under the Clinton administration, and you had a lot of you had the attacks in the embassies, the embassy attacks in 1998, the 2000 bombing of the USS Cole, all these things kind of pointing back to Islamic jihadists. And so there was a real push to try to get more attention paid. There's the infamous warnings of the one that's been talked about a lot, a report basically saying to the presidential intelligence report, bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S., bin Laden planning to trying to develop the capacity to use airplanes and drive them into buildings. And so obviously that was one thing that was heavily criticized later, is how did all this get missed? How did all the pieces not get put together? How did, even though there was this all this information that was out there as intelligence gathering, there were different investigations even of tracking the different hijackers and so forth. How did all the pieces not get put together? And so there remain many questions about everything that happened and what could have been done better. Some of the responses after the fact were to try to increase that intelligence sharing capacity, increase that information sharing capacity, so that everything kind of got funneled, to the same place, and the decisions could be made from there. That's why, and to increase the capacity for different agencies to share information with one another. And so this is why you have things like, this is why the Department of Homeland Security was created, to try to get some of these different agencies all under the same banner. This is why you had the Director of National Intelligence, that office that was created to try to coordinate intelligence sharing capacities. This is why you have things like fusion centers and joint terrorism task forces to kind of gather together information and share it across different agencies. But yeah, there's always the what if. What more could we have done? What could we have seen? What else is there that was missed? And so there's always going to be second guessing. That those are some of the official actions that were taken after 9/11 to try to make sure that something like this didn't happen again. And the FBI was really heavily criticized for having these investigations underway and not being able to put all of the different pieces together to share the information in a way that they could have done something to prevent them. And so the FBI, after 9/11, really undertook a major transformation. And they started to change from being an agency that really focused in on, they were traditional law enforcement agency. They investigated cases, they cleared them, they made arrests and they prosecuted them. The really traditional law enforcement agency. Then they started to, after 9/11, really transform into an intelligence, more of an intelligence agency, and being more focused on prevention and to really to respond to try to prevent major incidents from occurring, like this. How successful that endeavor has been, that's a whole nother question. That's a whole nother debate issue. And how something else I talk about in another video is, you have some of these, every time one of these major incidents comes up, you have a second guessing, okay, how could you have done this better? How did you not put all the pieces together? And you even have something like the U.S. Capitol attack, where a lot of that was being planned in plain sight and was being discussed in plain sight. And yet they couldn't put the pieces together to where they would actually be able to prevent that attack from occurring. And so it's how successful has it been? It's kind of a mixed bag. But at the same time, while there's a lot of criticism to go around, one thing that, the other side of that is, you don't necessarily know or see, or not much attention is paid to what was prevented. Because when something bad happens, when an attack occurs, when a crime occurs, that's visible. That you can see. You don't see or don't know what would have happened or could have happened if you didn't prevent it. So the goal is always to prevent something from occurring, to try to prevent crimes, attacks, and so forth from happening. But that doesn't really get as much attention or credit because it's not something that you can point to and not something that you can see. And it's always a skepticism. Okay, was that really going to happen? Or is it the possibility of a failed or foiled plot being overblown? So that's something that you don't, it's difficult to say. So right now, let me see if I can pull this up. CNN.
We'll be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Page and Lieutenant.
I'm actually going to go to the, let's go to the NBC one. So you can see the first
moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
We've been watching President Bush, who was down in Florida for what was supposed to be an educational event. Instead, he is racing back to Washington as we speak. The president making a very brief statement in Sarasota, calling it an apparent terrorist attack on our nation. Again, that is unconfirmed, and promising the full resources of the federal government to not only help the victims, but also to investigate. And before asking people to pray with him, the president's saying that this act will not stand. As he was speaking, we got a report from Reuters that a plane was hijacked from Boston. A plane out of Boston was hijacked. But again, that is unconfirmed. We had a report earlier from the Associated Press that there had been a hijacking. Now Reuters is reporting that a plane out of Boston was hijacked. An American Airlines aircraft, we understand, was the plane that was hijacked. This would be in keeping with an earlier eyewitness report that the first plane that plowed into the World Trade Center was a 737. Former FBI agent James Kallstrom is...
All right, so that was the first comments of the president on that morning. And so hopefully you heard and caught all of that. Let me make sure I got my... there. And again, he was at an elementary school listening to a story that was being read at school, showed him being prepared to make comments about education programs. And that's the first point in time where the word terrorism is mentioned in terms of official government capacity. And so calling it, okay, this is an apparent terrorist attack on our country. And so at that point in time, the vice president, Dick Cheney, and some cabinet members and so forth, their government officials, national security team, they're all down in the bunker of the White House working on this and trying to figure out everything that's going on. The president heads back over to the Air Force One, goes up into the plane. He is out of Washington until very much later that day. He doesn't return there until the evening. So he's up in Air Force One because they don't know, okay, is there somebody in the, is he going to be at risk? Is he a target? And so he's up in the air and kind of coming down at different Air Force bases and trying to keep his location as secret as possible. Because again, trying to figure out exactly everything that's going on and what's happening. So it's just going to be a couple minutes from now at 9:37 where Flight 77 is going to be crashing into the Pentagon. And so it comes over D.C. and it's coming, came out of D.C., turned around, it's coming back, and it's got a long stretch close to the ground that it kind of goes along, and it even, believe if I'm remembering, it might have hit like a lamppost or something, knocked something. I believe it knocked a lamppost down along the way, and just kind of came in at a kind of a flat angle right into the side of the Pentagon. And so they're going to move over to show, after that happens, the fires at the Pentagon. And so there's a lot of chaos there too, because they're trying to, even at the other side of the building, they could kind of feel or hear what was. You could hear like a loud bang that happened over on the other side of the building. And this is a massive building, a massive complex. Thousands and thousands of people come into the Pentagon, just like the World Trade Centers, every single day. And so you can see that the targeting is of these particular sites is to maximize the impact. And so that's why these particular, you've got tens of thousands of people working in each one of these different buildings. I don't know about the Capitol, but in terms of tens of thousands, but certainly thousands of people working in these different buildings at this time. And to crash planes into them is to attempt to maximize the impact of these attacks. So again, if you're just joining it, thank you for joining and watching this. I hope that this is my attempt to kind of bring us all back to this day. And for so many who were not alive to see or were very young, including many of my students who just, many of whom were not even born yet when all of this happened. And it's something that you just don't get a sense of later on. You don't really, you know of it, you know that it's a major event that happened, you know some of the impacts that it had, but unless you kind of put yourself back as best you can in that moment, in that time, it's really hard to fully understand exactly what the event was like and why was this such a big deal? Why was this something that was so impactful? Why did this change and shape the course of America for the next 20 years and beyond? And the only way I can think you can do that is to actually just go back and just see what it was like. And you'll watch videos of this, but to go back in kind of real time and just kind of see everything that happened, it gives you a sense of how quickly all of this came about, how fast everything occurred, and how much and shifted and was changing as these different attacks occurred, and then you're trying to figure out exactly how to respond to it, how to make sense of it. Okay, what is going to be happening? What's going to be happening next? Is there going to be more attacks? And so you can understand the trauma that was felt and the fear that came out of this, and why the fear of terrorism went from not even registering on the scale to being the number one fear for many years that people in America would indicate that was their top fear. And this is also the turning point for the focus on being on Islamic jihadist terrorism. The focus really shifting into this being a major threat. And it's a uniquely different threat too, because terrorism was different, it was thought of differently before this time. There was, there were certainly terrorist attacks, but they were kind of all over the board. They were coming from lots of different ideologies, and I have other videos, some up now, some uploading later, and even in the U.S., how the terrorist threat kind of changed and shifted over the course of decades. And you could kind of see, it starts with the far left starts way before that. It starts with the far right when you go back and you look at the terrorism of slavery in the post-slavery era, and then you go back, look at segregation and the lynchings and the terrorism of Black Americans, and then you get to the far left with kind of the backlash, the social backlash and upheaval of the 1960s and 70s, and you had the Black nationalist movements and the anti-war movements in that time, and you can see the outgrowth of the terrorism from that in terms of increase in far left. And then you had the anti-government a movement that really started to take off in the late 1980s, 1990s, and Islamic jihadist terrorism was kind of bubbling under the surface there. But in the U.S., it wasn't a major focus. It started to be a focus a little bit in other nations, especially in the Middle East. And this is one thing I'm working on right now. And the video that I'm putting together on Islamic jihadist terrorism is looking at, because I don't think I did a good job in some of my past videos on this, because I started with kind of, okay, there's turmoil in the Middle East. Now let's go to how did bin Laden and how did Al-Qaeda start? But how did the broader extremist ideology movement get started? And to do that, you have to go back and look at World War I, and you have to look at the way the Middle East was structured and the political dynamics there, and then you have to go to look at conflicts with Iran and Saudi Arabia in the 1979 was a very crucial year, so I'll get more into that. But that kind of got started and kind of started bubbling, but was still under the surface, and it wasn't until this major impactful event that it was like, okay, this is something that we really need to pay close attention to. And even now, over the course of the last 20 years, the focus has been on Islamic jihadist terrorism, but it's really shifted too over the last few years, over the last decade really. And again, we always focus on the past threat, right? We never look at sometimes until the next threat until it's too late. But the far right terrorism has really been bubbling underneath the surface for a long time now. And so that has really come and it's surpassed Islamic jihadist terrorism as being the top terrorism threat in the U.S. And I go into that in greater detail in other videos as well, and we'll discuss it further at length. But I mean, in terms of the number of deaths from extremists in the last decade, no one comes close to the far right. Of course, then if you look at and you consider in terms of total casualties from terrorism in terms of just the U.S. specifically, I mean, nothing comes close to this. Nothing comes close to 9/11. It supersedes everything else, and it kind of drowns out any other, it overshadows any other deaths. So if you look at that, then certainly this is the most impactful event. It is the biggest terrorist attack in the history of the United States, and possibly, depending on how you measure it, possibly the world. That's more debatable, but certainly in the history of the United States. And now you're starting to see the footage from when the Pentagon was hit. And so you can see them kind of breaking away to the Pentagon. Wish I had a laser pointer or something I could put on there. But you can certainly see that coming through here. Let's see where we're at. 44. All right, so now it's at 42. So this was just about 2 minutes ago. This is when the decision was made to ground all air traffic and all flights in the U.S. So this is the point where all flights are going to be grounded, and they're all going to be coming redirected to different airports in the U.S. and airports in Canada, and all incoming flights that were coming in from overseas, because you got to think, you have how much air traffic you have every day, thousands of flights that are being made every single day. You have flights coming in from overseas, like from Europe, for example, that are heading to New York, that are heading to D.C., and those are all being diverted over into other airports, most specifically up into Canada. And so the massive undertaking that it would have been to try to address all these thousands of flights that are in the air at this particular time is just mind-boggling. And it takes like about 2.5 hours before they're actually able to clear the airspace and to get all the flights out. And at the same time, you're trying to figure out, okay, now that we have a different attack in a different city against a different, another major target. Because any kind of major landmark, symbol, whatnot, is going to be a target for an attack, because it's going to get more attention and be more impactful and stick with people's minds to a greater extent. Now you've had two in New York, and you've had one in D.C. at the Pentagon, one of the most secure buildings in the entire world. And so panic ensues. I mean, you can only imagine what you're thinking if you're pretty much anywhere else. Am I going to be next? Am I a target? Is this going to happen to me now? Is this something that, what's next? What's going to happen? You don't know when you're in that moment. And so it's at this point that other buildings in D.C. are being evacuated. The White House, the Capitol are all being evacuated. Any place that would be considered a high-value target, a high-profile target, places with a lot of people in them, national landmarks, other public areas, everything is being completely evacuated. Because, again, you just don't know what's going to happen and what's going to be, what could be targeted next. And it's rightfully so that they were doing that, because, again, I mentioned this earlier, but Flight 93 is still in the air. It's the last hijacked plane that's still in the air, and all indications are that that plane was going to be aimed at the U.S. Capitol. All right. So it's at this point where the towers have been burning for some time now. You had the first hit that happened about an hour ago on the North Tower, almost exactly to this point. It was at 8:46. And so the fire has been burning for an hour now. The South Tower, a little bit less. It's been burning since 9:03 in the morning. And the significance of that amount of smoke, that amount of damage over this time is going to become very apparent when the unthinkable happens in just a matter of about 10 minutes from now. And so what is happening is that the fire that's continuing to burn, and this is the kind of the official, as best we can understand it from the official records and reports that have come out. Again, I made mention to the other explanations, and we'll get into those and discuss those in another forum at a different time, because I don't think this is the right forum and time at this time on the 20th anniversary of these events to kind of get into those. I did address a little bit of them at the beginning of the stream. But as the fires continue to burn, you can only imagine what a fire does. It's going to weaken everything around it. And so why is it burning this much? Well, you think if you're taking an airliner that's completely filled with jet fuel and you crash it into something, it's going to burn. And there's a lot of jet fuel in there that can burn for a long period of time. And so what it's happening is it's weakening the building as it continues to burn. And it's weakening the structure of it. It's weakening the steel. It's burning through the insulation. It's starting to spread throughout the building. The smoke is spreading throughout the building. And so you can only you can imagine how much that is kind of weakening this major structure. And one of the things that's mentioned or questioned is weren't these buildings, these massive high-rise buildings designed to withstand a plane crashing into them? And the answer is yes, of course they were. You'll see, obviously, the buildings were hit by a commercial airliner, each of them, and they're still standing. So being hit by a commercial airliner is just about the biggest thing that you could just slam into a building, and they're still standing. So what the buildings were not necessarily designed for is to be subjected to a long, extensive period of burning, and just basically setting the entire building on fire for such a long period of time. And so that is what's happening now, is the structural integrity of the building is weakening. And it's growing more and more unstable. And you have firefighters that are going up into the building, trying to get people out. You've got people continuing to come out of the building. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many people that have already lost their lives from the initial hits, that have lost their lives from the smoke, from the fire. And there are others that are just trapped. They're trapped up there. And if you're on the ground, it doesn't give you a good indication here. There's videos of it, many videos, photos. I decided just not to put those up on this point. And maybe I'll take a look at them at a later time, but I decided this wouldn't be appropriate to put those up at this point. But of people hanging out the windows of the buildings, because you had to smash the windows in the buildings to try and get some air because of all the smoke, and to be faced with just they're kind of hanging. Some accidentally falling out of the windows because they're just trying to get over to the air to get some air so they can breathe. And you're up there, and you're faced with the decision: what do I do? What do I do? Do I stay here and suffocate in the smoke? Do I burn in the fire, or do I take another route? And many people made the decision to jump out the buildings, because if you're in that situation and you know that you're not going to make it out of this, you've got one of two choices: you stay and die one way, or you jump and die a different way. And you can only imagine having to process that, and just how terrible that would have been. Can only imagine. That's the words can't describe. But that was the situation that they were facing. That was the choices that they were facing. And at this point, we're only a couple minutes away from the unthinkable happening, and I don't know, I'm trying to make suspense here, but you all know what's coming. And it's at this point that it's important to point out that the South Tower, the one that was hit second, is the one that collapses first. And so it only takes, it hits the tower at 9:03. So it takes about 55 minutes, less than an hour, for the South Tower, again, the one that was hit first, to collapse. Why was it the first one to collapse and it was hit second? Well, you can see the picture here on the left in the CNN feed. The South Tower is on the left, the North Tower is on the right. I mentioned this earlier, that it would be important and critical later where these planes hit. The South Tower hit lower on the building. And so when you take out and hit a section of a building at the bottom, then the fire is going to have more of an impact. It's going to weaken the more of the base of the building faster and spread throughout the building faster than when it's hit higher up toward the top. And so it's that very simple reason as to why the South Tower did not stand as long and ended up collapsing first. And you'll see that happening here in just the next couple minutes as they're kind of replaying the footage. And this is something that would be replayed quite a bit in the coming weeks. Let's see here. So I think that since we're coming up to this almost happening, I think I'm going to go to to play the footage here, to play what the real-time reaction was to this, and instead of me yapping over it. So let's go to this for just a couple minutes here. Let's see, I'm going to go to the NBC
side of the Pentagon.
I'm going to go to NBC.
This is a live picture we're just getting here. This is the firefighters battling the blaze at the Pentagon. Look.
So you can see the damage.
This is just going to be raw tape that Dave Statter and his crew are
just feeding into us.
You can see this apparent terrorist attack. A jet slammed into the Pentagon about 15-20 minutes ago, the helipad side on 395. We have no word yet on casualties. The Pentagon has been evacuated, has the White House.
I'm going to come back here for a second, but you can see in the NBC feed, you can see them at the, turn up just a little bit for the background. Yeah, now I can't actually hear this. So I got an indication earlier that I couldn't hear me over the video feed. So if you can't hear me, let me know. But you can see them over here at the Pentagon. You know, got the emergency crews there, trying to pull people out, trying to rescue those that they can. And here we go.
But there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and now it looks almost like a mushroom cloud explosion, this huge billowing smoke in the second tower. This was the second of the two towers hit. And I cannot see behind that smoke, obviously, as you can either. The first tower in front has not changed, and we see this extraordinarily and frightening scene behind us of this second tower, now just encased in smoke. What is behind it, I cannot tell you. But just look at that. That is about as frightening a scene as you will ever see. Again, this is going on now in two cities. We have a report that there's a fire at the State Department as well, and that is being evacuated. So we've got fires at the Pentagon evacuated, the State Department evacuated, the White House evacuated on the basis of what the Secret Service describes as a credible terrorist threat. We have two explosions, two planes hitting the World Trade Center here in New York, and what this second explosion was that took place about a part of the south, that would be the South Tower, has apparently collapsed. We don't know if that was from the impact of this first plane that hit it, or whether something else has happened there, and we'll work on that. Our Washington Bureau Chief, Frank Cesno, is on the phone. Frank, what are you hearing?
Aaron, I just drove past the Pentagon across the 14th Street Bridge, which is now choked with traffic. We're beginning to hear emergency sirens and rescue personnel fanning out across Washington. There is a gigantic black billowing cloud of smoke that is rising over the Pentagon. You heard Jamie McIntyre a moment ago describe where that was coming from. I can also tell you that local radio, in addition to talking about evacuations, as we've heard at the Pentagon, and the White House is reporting that the Capitol building has been evacuated and the Treasury Department has been evacuated. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, is exceptionally tense, and clearly taking steps as if it is virtually under siege here. We don't know specifically, as you've said, what has taken place at the Pentagon, but this is very serious.
All right, so you could hear just trying to figure out, okay, what in the world just happened? And as the building is starting to come down, what happened is the point where the plane hit was the first point that started to give way, and the first point that started to, everything kind of came down. And then because everything had been weakened so much by all the burning that happened, it kind of like was just a domino effect. One section of the building after another kind of collapsed into itself, and a lot of it just completely, as it was collapsing, just completely disintegrated. And that is the massive plume of smoke that you can see, and dust and everything just going everywhere. So much so that you could actually see it from the satellite images from space. It was that much. It was that much dust. It was just a massive dust cloud. And because the view was obstructed, at first you kind of hear, okay, what's happening? Are there parts of the building that are just breaking off? Are there things that are just, was it just part of the building that fell over? Was it, what exactly happened? And you can see in the smoke, it's not really all that. It can be confusing. Okay, is the building still standing? What actually happened? And so you can see the massive amount of confusion that is taking place right now. So, and it's about this time that many things are happening again all at once. But two things that are happening that are absolutely crucial right now is that everybody who is now in the North Tower, they hear the rumbling of what's happening next to them in the other tower. And for those who are still inside, and the rescue crews, the firefighters, and police officer in there, it's an indication of, we got to get out of here as quickly as possible, because if you're in that building, if the other tower just came down, this one's gonna. There's no reason to think this one's not going to come down too. And so you're stuck in a situation. Okay, what, do we keep going up? Do we keep going and trying to help people? Or do we try to get out? And there were, I don't have the exact number here. I wish I could look it up, but over 300 firefighters who died while trying to save people, trying to get people out of the towers. And at the same exact time, there's still a flight in the air, that Flight 93 again. And they've been contacting over the last 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes, friends, family members on their phones, and they are learning of the other attacks. They're getting an indication of, okay, what exactly is happening in New York. And so it's at this point in time where they're developing a plan to try to retake the plane. And they're going to be trying to barge their way into the cockpit to try and retake over the plane. And it's in just... So at this point in time right now, this is where they're going to be trying to do that. They're going to take out a couple of the other hijackers that are still out in the cabin area, and they're in a rush right now to try and get into the cabin of the plane. And over the course of the next few minutes is where, as they're trying to overtake the plane, they end up getting inside the cockpit, and the hijacker who is at the controls takes the plane and basically puts it into a nosedive and crashes it into a field in Pennsylvania and Somerset County, be exact, killing all 40 people that were on board. So among the many heroes of 9/11 are those just ordinary people, brave people, passengers inside of Flight 93 who made the fateful, incredibly courageous decision to try to take the plane back, knowing that it was going to be a decision that probably was not going to work out well for them, knowing that it was probably going to result in their deaths, but knowing that it was probably going to happen anyway, they made the decision to try to take the plane. And in the process of doing that, they saved the Capitol, likely. Is it, at the same time, is it likely that it could have been taken out before it hit? At this point, yes, but still, that's not in any way to... the passengers, they did what they did, and so their actions not only saved the beacon of U.S. democracy, it also saved many lives as well. And so you still see the massive confusion. There are reports of, at this time, there are different reports of other things that are happening, other possible attacks, other possible one that sticks out in particular is reports that weren't ultimately confirmed of a possible car bomb at the Pentagon. That was just a brief kind of rumor kind of thing that, it's just one of those things that comes up, and when you hear something, where is the next attack going to be coming from? But since at this point at 10:07 that Flight 93 has crashed, there are no other imminent threats at this point. New threats from other airplanes. Obviously, there's an imminent threat of dealing with the aftermath for those who are there, those who are, and especially at this point, those who are still in the North Tower. And the North Tower has about 20 minutes left until it collapses. So if you've been watching from the beginning, and again, thank you for joining me and being here as we reflect on this, you can see how quickly all of this has come about. And you can see how quickly things have changed over the course of this last hour and a half or so, and how quickly all this unfolded. And the amount of fear that would have come about from one attack after the other, seemingly, and just to try to figure out exactly where the next one could be coming from, what could be coming next. So let me go back to the questions here, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to, you can write them in the chat. I'm gonna kind of hit some of these questions that I received. What were some of the failures of security? I covered those a little bit. Was it preventable? Because there's something that could have been done to prevent this. There's a lot of things that could have been done, perhaps should have been done, actions that could have been taken. And there's a lot of criticism to go around, and there's a lot of blame to be pointed at. There you can see their replay of the tower collapse that's probably a better view than the one that was up earlier on the CNN feed. That one gives you more of a indication of it, how it actually came down. What could have been done? There's always a lot of blame to go around, but at the same time, we always have to be conscious of, we have a tremendous advantage right now of hindsight and to be able to look back. And that doesn't mean it's easy to look back and say, okay, well, you should have done this, you should have done that, you should have taken these actions. That is an easier position to be in than making the decisions in the moment. That doesn't mean that we should be uncritical or that there's no blame to go around or that people shouldn't be held accountable for making mistakes or not taking actions that they should have. That doesn't mean that at all, or doesn't mean there are no warning signs. That doesn't mean anything like that. It's just important to keep in mind that the bias that we have of being in here in the now and being able to look back. But it's also important to be able to look back and see, okay, what could have been done differently and how do we make changes so that something like this doesn't happen in the future. And one thing that we can say is that a lot of attention has been paid over the last 20 years to trying to secure what's referred to as hard targets. So targets that are like the World Trade Center, like the Pentagon, like the Capitol, targets that are kind of obvious, symbolic of if you hit them, they're going to be, and you attack them, they're going to be getting a lot of attention. That there's a lot of attention that's going to be paid to them, as I mentioned earlier. And there's been a better at security at many hard targets, much more so than there was 20 years ago. So I kind of make the argument that, yes, we're better at addressing hard targets. Now, in light of the attack on the U.S. Capitol, for example, maybe that could be, maybe that needs to be rethought a little bit. And I mentioned that in another video on terrorism, the goals of terrorism, violence, and the symbolism of different targets and why different targets are selected the way they are. But be that as it may, the one thing that we don't have a good handle on, the one thing that we haven't quite figured out is soft targets. And what I mean by soft targets is targets that are not as clearly identifiable, ones that don't kind of stick out, ones that you wouldn't quite think of. Large public places like malls, sports gatherings, concerts, train stations, other places where people would kind of congregate together in the same space that would be attractive to hit. The amount of soft targets that there are infinitely greater than the number of hard targets. And we're not quite as good at trying to secure soft targets because it's a balancing act. You can't. There's not enough resources. There's not enough ability to try to secure all these soft targets. And even if you could do that, would you want to? Do you want to have security at every single point around every single possible soft target? Imagine what that would entail, what that would look like, what that would mean. And so this is where you get into the push and pull between we want to secure different potential targets, but we also want to not live in a police state where we basically everything is completely locked down and put through a police filter, and everybody's actions at every single moment are scrutinized, and you can't go anywhere to do anything. The idea of trying to over-secure soft targets, if you tried to do that, you can see the reaction that many people would have to it, and in some cases overblown, other cases, rightfully so. You can understand the reaction when you look at the reaction to places closing and lockdowns and everything over the course of the last year and a half with the coronavirus pandemic. And just the backlash to just the closing of different buildings that's going one direction of security and perhaps being over secure in some cases, but that's what the reaction would be like. So you can get an indication and see what it would be like if we over secured soft targets, how well that would be taken. And so there's the question of how much do we want to restrict people's liberties as a result? So we haven't done as good a job with soft targets. So that is a ongoing area and issue of concern. Safety protocols that were implemented after 9/11 for large, tall buildings like this. That is not in the course of this was taken into account with the new World Trade Center building that was built. That's something I don't know about the specifics of the architectural design and so forth of that building, but there was definitely a lot of thought into trying to put secure other large buildings like this. And so, but one of the things that sticks out in terms of like the fear afterward and trying to come up with solutions is there was a lot of discussion of, okay, what do you do if you're stuck in a building like this and it gets hit? Are you secure if you're in other large buildings? And unless you're talking about buildings that have already been, but buildings that you're constructing new, where you can try to account for that and think of new ways to either build them more securely or try to build them in a way that makes it harder for them to be subject to the same kind of stresses that were put into place here. In terms of existing buildings, what do you do? The only thing you can really do is to make sure they don't get attacked. So, but there was a lot of discussion. I don't know if a lot, but there was some discussion afterwards of trying to put ways for people to get out. I mean, there were companies that were selling all sorts of gear and tech to prepare for something like this. Like one thing that always sticks out in my mind is parachutes. And the company that started to sell, many companies started to sell different parachutes that you could put in different high-rise buildings that people could use to jump out and parachute down. That was something, I don't think that was widely implemented by any means, but it was certainly something that stuck out to me as, I'm not saying a good idea, but it was something that came up. It was something that stuck with me. So yeah, that, excuse me. So that was certainly, there's a lot to say in terms of, that was something I have to look more into in terms of safety and evacuation procedures. But one thing to keep in mind, though, too, is whenever you're trying to think of safety procedures to prevent from being in the same situation that you're in, that you find yourself in an attack, like the World Trade Center towers get hit, and you're trying to figure out a way to, okay, how do we make sure that people try to kind of get out, or they have the ability to get out? You're looking to, how do we prevent this same thing from happening again? But if an attack like this were to happen again, it wouldn't happen necessarily in the same way. In fact, it probably wouldn't. It would come in a different way. And so the thought process needs to shift and change over time to what is the threat now and what is the potential threat going forward, as opposed to how do we prevent the threat from yesterday. And so you could take a lot of precautions to try to prevent something like this from happening, but the chances of something to this level and effect like this happening again are much, much slimmer and much, much lower than they, certainly than they were on 9/11, but there's so much attention now being paid to something like this that it's hard to imagine that it could happen like this again. But it won't necessarily, I mean, it doesn't really have to. Not all terrorist attacks are like this. This is probably the most rare and terrorist attack in history. In terms of not only how it was carried out, the impact in terms of its casualties in the immediate and also in the aftermath, but also in terms of the long-term impact that it had on U.S. Policy and policy across the world, and the impact that it had, and it still resonates with everybody. I mean, there's you can kind of put it up. There's this, and at a very distant second is the Oklahoma City bombing, which is probably the second greatest terror attack in terms of casualties. Most of them are smaller. Most of incidents of terrorism don't actually have any casualties. They're just either attempts or just different attacks where people are injured. And most of them are not anywhere like this in terms of scale or impact. So we have to look at what the actual threats are and what the potential is for them. And you can only imagine, I mean, if most terrorist attacks were like this, it'd be a whole different ballgame in terms of what we concentrate on and what we focus on. So at this point, it is 10:23. That's what I have on my clock. And we're only a few minutes away from the second tower collapsing. That happens at 10:28. So in about 5 minutes from now. And one thing that I haven't touched on too much is just the impact of people that are on the ground right now in the area around the towers, because you're down there and you're looking up and you're seeing everything. You're hearing kind of the everybody kind of coming out, and you're also sitting there. You saw the one tower come down, and before that you were seeing bodies of people that had either dropped or had jumped, and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. And then all of a sudden these towers, they start collapsing, and the smoke just kind of and the debris and the dust just completely engulfs the entire area and completely engulfs you everywhere. And I'll show some photos of that here in a couple minutes after the footage reaches the point where the second tower collapses. I can transition away from that a little bit. But that dust completely uncovered everybody in the area, and people were kind of just unrecognizable. At that point, everybody was kind of painted with the same tannish dust cloud, and they were all kind of consumed by it. And it was over the course of the next couple decades, you saw the actual the casualties from 9/11 escalate even far after the attacks, because of all of the illnesses that people got, the first responders, the people that were nearby, from working and consuming this dust. Thousands of people died afterward as a result of inhaling all of this, these fumes. And so let me see if I have the actual numbers here. I don't know if I do have them. I know it's in the thousands, though. All right, so it's just, oh, there it goes. Oh, that's from earlier. Okay. That's not quite yet, but in about 2 minutes. You can see the footage here, the CNN footage. Make that a little bit, of people running away as the towers are collapsing. Let me actually go to that here.
The plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go. And then I heard that another plane hit, and if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh my God.
All right, ma'am, thank you. That is one of the witnesses to these extraordinary events this morning here in New York. Again, and I know that for many of you, you've heard this a lot, but I think it's important as people join us as they do in moments like this. They are coming in all the time, that there have been attacks.
All right, I'll mute that again. Got to note that my mic volume was a little low, so hopefully that you can, oh, there it goes here.
Tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing. Good Lord. There are no words. You can see large pieces of the building falling. You can see the smoke rising. You can see a portion of the side of the building now just being covered on the right side as I look at it, covered in smoke. This is just a horrific scene and a horrific moment. The president, who is in Florida today, is en route back to the White House. He took off a short time ago. The White House itself has been evacuated on the basis of what the Secret Service says was a credible threat on the mansion itself. We believe now that we can say that that portions of both towers of the World
Trade Center. I'll pull that back a little bit. In many of these moments, I think it's just important to let the actual, at the time, kind of speak for itself. And the in-the-moment reactions. But you could see just the whole buildings just completely start to give way, and everything kind of collapsed around it. You can see the dust cloud. There's the Statue of Liberty there on the feed on the right, and just the smoke that's just, and the dust that's just completely enveloped all of lower Manhattan. And I turned my mic back up. I got kind of a little system set up here, but let me know if you still can't hear. Try to talk a little bit louder too. Yeah, that kind of speaks for itself. In about a half an hour, there's going to be a call basically to completely evacuate all of lower Manhattan. And so there's the process of trying to get out 1 million people who live in the area, the people who live there, the people who work there, all the people who are there visiting in that particular time, trying to get everybody out. And so to try to completely clear the area throughout the next couple hours into, and again, that order isn't given until 11 o'clock, but to try to get as many people out of there as possible to minimize casualties, to open up the area for the workers to try to get in, and to rescue workers to get in. And you can see here just the smoke kind of coming through and past the towers there, or the remaining buildings. And it's really a wonder that more damage wasn't done than there was. I mean, there's the buildings that surrounding the towers have, many of them were damaged. At least one, being World Trade Center 7, fell down itself. But that there wasn't more damage, that there wasn't more buildings that were hit and impacted. It's really a wonder that wasn't. It's amazing that wasn't the case. So, okay. So that kind of is the end of all the major points, the major kind of events that came about in terms of the attacks, and now it's all a matter of dealing with the aftermath, dealing with the rescue, and trying to get as many people out of the towers as possible. And while they were able to pull some people out, they were not able to save that many people. It's maybe 20s that they were able to actually pull out of the rubble of the towers. And it would be another little over 10 years before the memorials there were finally finished and were finally erected there. One of the questions I got was, have I been to the memorial? Yes, I have. I've been to the World Trade Center one. I've been by the Pentagon, but I haven't actually been over to the building. But I have been to the World Trade Center Memorial. It's something that I do recommend. Everybody kind of go see, and so it's pretty impactful when you're actually there, and you can see the two spots where the pools are now, and you can see the new Trade Center building, and you can kind of go in and see underneath where the Trade Center was, and you can see a lot of the steel, and you can walk around the perimeter of where the old building was underneath, and you can kind of be at the exact spots where those planes hit hundreds of feet up in the air from the exact spot where you're standing. So it's pretty impactful. I do recommend everybody kind of going to see it at least once. So now it's at this point where we kind of get into some of the aftermath. And so, because the aftermath, and I've talked about this a little bit, and I've kind of alluded to it and touched on it in different ways, but the aftermath is, how do we deal with this and how do we respond to it? And out of the outgrowth of that came the war on terror, the wars in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq. And so the idea was, again, to go into Afghanistan, where bin Laden was held up, where he was hiding, and to bring him to justice. And so I mentioned this earlier, but there was kind of the immediate aftermath was there was the fear, and there was kind of we are going to address not only this one specific group, but terrorism in general. And so we're going to address all terrorism throughout the world. And that is where things kind of get a little bit messy and get a little bit fuzzy in terms of the aftermath and how everything was interpreted, because that's where kind of we start to get into a little bit of arguments amongst ourselves on what we should actually be doing, and the mission of and targeted of what is our intent, what's our goals here, starts to get really muddled. But you can see in the aftermath of everything that you've just seen over the last hour and a half of why there was such a direction of we need to address terrorism. But the mission broadened from one individual or one group to all of terrorism. And the idea was we're going to stamp out terrorism wherever it is. We're going to hit all these groups. But to be able to do that is a massive mission and an expansion. And so the war on terror not only it came to signify the next 20 years, but it was a direct reaction to the fear that of the tragedy of 9/11. And when we're afraid of things, we tend to overreact. And over the course of this time, we ended up over kind of compensating. And that was one of the goals stated of bin Laden and what he wanted to try to do. Is he wanted to hit us hard to the point where we would come in to the Middle East. And in his mind, his thought was, okay, I'm going to draw America into this conflict here. And I'm going to bring them in, and they're going to fight on this turf. And we'll have one of two things will happen. One, I'm going to draw them in, and they're going to be in a prolonged conflict where they're going to be bogged down here for a long period of time, or I'm going to beat them. He thought his forces could beat the U.S. military. He was wrong on that count. But on the other count, that's where we get into where we find ourselves today. And here now we have 20 years later, and we have two wars, one that ended 10 years ago, but arguably didn't necessarily end. We'll get back to that in a moment. But the war in Afghanistan just came to an end officially just a couple weeks ago, really in the lead up to 9/11. 20 years later, it was still ongoing. And the amount of time, money, effort, the number of people that have lost their lives since has been enormous. And one has to wonder, what was the purpose of it all? Because when you notice that as soon as the decision was made to pull out of Afghanistan finally after 20 years, it was immediate second guessing of, was this the right decision? Should we have left? Should we have pulled out? Should we have stayed? So there was that back and forth there, and you see it's been all over the media ever since, just kind of hammering away at the decision to leave Afghanistan, and the chaos of the people in Kabul trying to scramble to get onto airplanes so they could leave, and trying to get out of that situation, knowing the Taliban was coming in back to take over. But we have to kind of take stock of 20 years later what the world kind of looks like now as opposed to what it looks like then. And the questions are our interventions in other countries, have they made us safer or have they made it worse? That's an open question. That's one that's up for debate. But it's hard to argue that and make the case that the overall terrorism threat in the world is lower now than it was 20 years ago. And the argument for staying is keeping things stable. But at the same time, we've been there for 20 years and nothing has seemingly improved. We can look back to Iraq for lessons of this. When we were in Iraq, and I'm going to go into more detail about this in subsequent videos, including one I'm going to post later today or tomorrow, that looks at the situation in Iraq. And when we left Iraq, it created when we went into Iraq, regardless of putting aside the decision to go, the reasoning behind it, But when we went about trying to, when we went in there and kind of broke up the Iraqi government, deposed Saddam Hussein, it created a situation where it took something that was kind of stable and completely upended it. And so it took a lot of things that were simmering underneath the surface there and just kind of boiled them up and amplified them and created a bigger terrorism threat than there in that area than there was before. So we're never really going to know what the difference would have been. But how do we know? Would we have been better off if we had never done either of these wars? Would we be better off if we hadn't gone there to begin with? Would we be better off if we didn't take the approach of invasions? Would there be the same level of terrorism threat, or would it have kind of died down with 9/11? Would 9/11 have been the peak, or instead of being the starting point? That is something we'll never know, but it's something to think about in terms of our reactions to things, how we respond to them, and what we can take away from trying to decide what we do next and what we do in the future. Because if we keep repeating the same mistakes, then we're going to continue to have similar outcomes. And to look back at the Iraq, at the point where we ended up leaving, it wasn't too long after that there was a power vacuum that kind of was filled by Al-Qaeda in Iraq that had changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq. And later, when it expanded into Syria, changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, ISIL, however you want to term it. There was that vacuum there. And something comes in to fill it when you completely destabilize an area, and something is going to come in to fill that void. And it was the Al-Qaeda terrorist groups, the group that came in and filled that void, that eventually created ISIL. You could look at that situation in one of two ways. Excuse me. You could look at it in terms of, should we have left in the first place? Should we have left? Should we have stayed there and tried to maintain a stable situation because it was unstable as soon as we left? So there's the argument for staying. The other argument is, if the situation was so unstable, then what would it have been any different if we had left at any other time? Would have staying there made a difference? If it was so unstable after spending so much time and effort and money into trying to build up a stable government and a stable military in Iraq and Afghanistan, what difference would it have made to stay longer if we would have ended up with the same outcome regardless? Should we have poured more money into it and cost more American lives because of it? Or was it just time to pull the plug? So depending on your orientation, you could look at it and come to two different conclusions. We should never have left, or we shouldn't have been there in the first place, and being there longer is not going to make a difference except for drain more money and cost more lives. So that's the situation we're at in terms of because Iraq and Afghanistan, they kind of fell similarly. The governments and the militaries that we built up fell rather quickly. And it was kind of a replay. As all this was happening in Afghanistan, I just kept rethinking of how everything came about in Iraq as well. The same situation happened. So was it worth in some estimates are that we spent, depending on what estimates you look at, but somewhere upwards of $6 trillion. $6 trillion in the aftermath. And depending on what you figure that out, it's $150 to $350 million per day, every day for 20 years. What else could we have done with that money? What else could we have done with all of that money? What other programs could have been spent on? And are we better off now than we were then? So those are the questions. And then there's you got now at this point so many people coming back that are military service members coming back saying, what was it all for? What was I there for? What was the point of all of this? Why was I there for this long? Why did I risk my life there for something that ended up collapsing so quickly? It seemed like it was for nothing. That's a tough situation to be in. That's a tough pill to swallow. And if you're in the military, you can kind of, I've heard many service members talk about like how they didn't really understand very well what the veterans from Vietnam were talking about, and now they really do, in terms of what they were there for and what the whole purpose of it was. And it's hard to argue with that. I mean, it's hard to I don't know if argue with that, but it's hard to say like, okay, yeah, it really was worth it, or it's kind of hard to say that you shouldn't feel that way, because that's they risk their lives there on a mission. But even many of them were kind of like, what was the mission for? What was our purpose? What are we actually doing here now? Especially after 2011, once bin Laden was killed, what's our mission and purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? Not getting very clear answers, not getting a very clear direction. So, I mean, you can understand why so many are angry at the decision to leave. And you can also understand why so many are just thankful that it's ended. And I guess the one thing to consider is, should we stay in these countries and not make any improvements and not actually make ourselves safer? Or should we concentrate on putting our resources into what we can do to make ourselves safer and better our lives here at home? So that's the kind of things that we're all kind of trying to figure out now. But should we stay just to avoid the inevitable, I guess, is the if we're keep doing the same thing as not making any kind of a difference, should we continue to try to do it, or should we try a different strategy? And if we're just going to continue to stay and continue to pump more resources and continue to risk lives unnecessarily, what would be the purpose of it? Is it more? And then there's the question of respect to our military service members who did put their lives in line, and those who did sacrifice, and are combat veterans. And what would be respectful to them? Is it disrespectful to them to just abandon the mission and to give up? Or is it more respectful to them to not risk creating more combat veterans and more casualties and risk more lives just to avoid facing an inevitable truth? And then there's the question of, even if we did decide we want to stay there and continue to the mission as it was, what do we look at now in terms of, like, where is the threat coming from? Is there still a threat there in Afghanistan? Because one thing I will say is, as I'm watching what happened in Afghanistan, if you have to, it wasn't an exact replay of what happened in Iraq, but there were a lot of similarities. And if I was going to pick which one I'd rather have in terms of, if I was going to pick, do I want a situation in Iraq that eventually leads to a group like ISIL, or do I want a Taliban in Afghanistan? This is a better alternative, I would say. I'd much rather go with the Taliban than ISIL. And if we're pretty much in a situation where you're going to pick between one of those two options. And one is much more of a direct threat, and one is much more brutal than the other. So there's that to consider. There's a lot of other different aspects of this to cover, but that would require a lot more. I'd have to go kind of into different other aspects of it, but let me address some of the other questions. Let me look into some of the other questions that I received here. Let's see here, because I want to make sure I hit on some of those as well. And then I'm going to kind of conclude with where we're at now and what we're looking at. I think I got most of these questions here. And there's a lot of good questions here that I think would require a lot more thought on my part to kind of address and respond to. And so there's a lot of good ideas here for additional videos that I can put together, or an additional other live streams in the future to kind of cover those. Put this up here.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City. One report said, and we can't confirm any of this, that a plane may have hit one of the two towers of the World Trade Center, but again...
I'll just put myself up there fully. All right, so now we're in a situation where I'm looking at everything that's been happening is, where do we go from here? And the one thing I would have to look at is, where is America broken? Did 9/11 break America? Did it break us? Did it break our spirits? Did it break our trust in each other? Did it break our trust in our government? And it certainly had a strong hand at doing that. But the seeds were kind of already planted. But you can draw a direct line from what happened at 9/11 to the war in Iraq. You can draw a direct line from Iraq to the election of President Barack Obama. You can draw a direct line from the election of President Obama to, you can draw a direct line from the Iraq war and the decision to leave Iraq and so forth. And all that, you can draw that to ISIL, and without the President Obama, without ISIL, you don't have the election of President Donald Trump and everything that came after that. And then without all that, without 9/11, you don't have an insurrection at the Capitol, and probably don't have the same level of far-right terrorism threat that we have today. There's a direct line along the way. And we're in a situation right now where we're all kind of fearful of each other, and we don't really trust each other. And that's a dangerous place to be. That's not a place where you really want to be as a nation. And how do we get out of this? I'm not really sure. I don't have like a crystal ball, or I don't have any major good answers. But one thing that it kind of I think helped explain the situation of what happened after 9/11 is, we all became fearful, and we started looking toward the other. There was this other group. There's this other entity that came to try to attack us and hurt us. And of all places, the one thing I think that sums this up better than anything else that I've heard is actually from John Carpenter, horror director, directed Halloween and The Thing. But what he said was, when talking about horror and stories about horror, there's two types of stories you can tell. It's all about where the location of evil is in the world. And we can imagine if we're sitting around talking and we're on a campfire and the wise man's talking about the location of evil, where it is, and he says evil is out there. It's somewhere else. It's out in the dark. It's beyond the woods. It's some kind of external evil, something that's coming to get us, something that that we need to be afraid of, some of the people that don't act like us, that don't look like us, that don't speak like us, that are different from us. That's where the evil is. That's the external evil. That particular story is an easier one to tell. That's an easier one that people will buy into, the external evil. It's a lot harder to tell a story of, well, actually evil is right here. It's within all of us. It's in our own human hearts. That story is a harder one to tell. It's a harder one for people to accept. And it's harder to say that I've met the enemy and he is us, that we are the enemy. That's a harder story to tell. It's a lot easier to look at the other. And after 9/11, we started looking for others. After there's Osama bin Laden, then there's Iraq, and there's other terrorist groups, and then there's Iran and North Korea, and once we started running through the others outside of the U.S., then it started to turn back around, and we started to turn on each other. After 9/11, if you were kind of against any kind of intervention, you were seen as unpatriotic. If you questioned military decisions or interventions, you were seen as unpatriotic, or you were seen as part of the problem or the enemy, or not being strong enough, not being too weak on terror, too weak on terrorism, not committed to the war on terror. And so, I mean, that's evidenced in the fact that so many. I mean, this is not specific to any one party or any. I mean, if you look at the decisions of support for the Patriot Act, the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the vast majorities of politicians of both parties supported and voted for all of those measures. So it's not a matter of any one particular party. In fact, that you can. So it's at least at that particular point. So it's once you get into that, it's kind of, we started looking for other things to blame, and we started blaming each other and turned it on each other. And when you start learning things like, we were told that there were weapons of mass destruction, there weren't weapons of mass destruction. We were told that they were going to be that it was going to be quick and easy to go in Iraq. They were going to treat us as liberators, and then it turns into complete chaos. We were told it's going to be easy interventions, and we're end up there for 20 years. It kind of coincides with a lot of distrust in the official narrative of the 9/11 attacks, and all the idea of it being an inside job that up to half of Americans now don't believe that the events that I just went through over the last couple hours are what happened. And so then you get into, now we're starting to, I mean, the rhetoric after 9/11 was, I mentioned the other, but there was a lot of hate directed toward Muslims, and Muslims around the world, but Muslims in the U.S. And that hate kind of, fear and hate, because fear breeds hate, kind of started looking at other targets. Then it came Hispanics. Then it became people to fear coming over the border, They're coming. They're going to come and harm you, so we need to do something to protect them. They're bringing drugs and crime, as it was termed. So there's always a new enemy and threat, and then once those kind of get worked through, then it starts to turn back around, and it starts to look at, okay, well, maybe the threat is each other. The threat is socialists, or it's black people. That's the one that's been the most pervasive in U.S. throughout our history of the country. Or it's the protesters, they're a threat to America. Or it's Antifa. And if you look at it from, now we have a threat. We're looking at each other in terms of it's kind of always one group against the other one, and now you've got people vaccinated versus anti-vaxxers, or people that want to wear masks and people that don't want to wear masks, and finding always kind of pitting one group against the other. And sometimes so that's kind of what we've kind of solidified, that mindset of one group against the other group, and always trying to other us instead of focusing on what we all have in common. And when it comes down to it, we're all afraid of the same things. We all fear the same things. We all fear death. We all fear loss of loved ones, loss of identity. All these things, we are afraid of the same, fear the same things. And so there's a lot of common threads in what we're afraid of. And when we're fearful of something, it's easy for us to be put down the wrong path, or it's easy for that fear to be redirected in a place where perhaps it shouldn't be. And so that is where you get a lot of the rhetoric and the direction toward different groups that may not be a major threat, or just are more like us than not like us. They get turned into a major threat. And it's something that we have to deal with, and we have to look at. And something we have to really wrestle with is, how do we want to respond? And what direction do we want to take going forward? And do we want to continue down this path? Because the path that we're on now is not a pretty one, and it doesn't end in a good place. And we're not in a good place now, and it's not getting seemingly any better. So that's where I'm kind of reflecting at this point. And so there's no immediate answers. This is more of just an informal reflection. And so, but it's some things to think about. Where do we go from here? And what do we want our country to look like? And one thing we need to do is we need to be able to recognize when we may have made mistakes and when we may have been wrong, because there's a pervasive aversion to admitting to being wrong about something. And the fact of the matter is, we're all wrong about stuff all the time. We all, and even if we're talking about different like conspiratorial thinking and looking at the other and trying to project onto them, or to try to blame others. And a lot of us might get upset right now, for instance, with those who are refusing vaccines, or those who are refusing to wear masks. And rightfully so. I've wrestled with that myself. But at the same time, we have to remember that they're just like, we're all more alike than we aren't. And we all believe some pretty dumb stuff. And we all believe things that aren't true. And it's hard to accept the idea that something we believed for so long might not be true. And so whenever I might start to get upset at somebody for not believing, for not following the science, for believing kooky things, for putting other people in danger, I got to remember hey, I believed some dumb stuff too. And only later to learn that it wasn't true. So accepting that is difficult, but it would be good for us to come to a way to try to figure out how we can accept when we're wrong and accept other people's ideas, and even to just not judge too critically or to get at each other's throats too much. I think taking the temperature down is a good thing. It's a hard thing to do right now, though. So where do we go from here? I'm not sure, but we have some challenging times ahead of us, and we have to figure out what the next 20 years are going to look like, and how we're going to shape them, and how we're going to leave our mark on them. So, for those of you who have been watching this that were too young to remember what happened, at least hopefully now you have an idea. You've sat through and watched some of it, and there's lots of other things that you can watch to get a sense of it. But and I'll have a lot more videos specifically addressing a lot of different topics. There's a lot of things I have planned, and I thank you for being here and watching. But think about how you want the next 20 years to be, because you weren't there, you weren't able to shape, you're not responsible in any way or for the last 20 years. But there's a lot you can do about the next 20. There's a lot that you can do to shape the next 20 years. And it's in all of our hands, but it's in your hands too. And so that's where I wanted to leave off, is that we've got a lot of work to do. And I don't know where we're going to be, but the ball's in all of our court, and so we got some serious reflection to do. Because if we don't address the differences that we have, and if we don't start to figure out a way to work together or how to deal with each other, doesn't end in a good place. So now that I'm over that, I think I'm going to end there. Again, I'll have more videos to kind of post on. So thank you all for joining. I sent this out to hundreds of people, and being realistic, I was kind of thinking about if I can get maybe 10 people to kind of watch it, I'll be in a good place. And I had somewhere around 10 for most of it. So thank you for joining me. This will stay up on my channel, and I'm going to have a lot more to say about a lot of different topics. And stay tuned for the video I'll have coming out on the rise of Islamic jihadist terrorism. And for those of you who are in my current class, I'll have another announcement with specifics on what's to come next. So thank you all. Stay safe, and have a good one.